I never fucked anybody over in my life. Didn't have it coming to me. You got that? All I have in this world is my balls and my word. And I don't break them for no one. You understand?
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
I work for Kaiser Soze.
Tu me déçois énormément.
I work for Kaiser Soze.
Je suis colère, les enfants, je suis colère.
Hey, what's up, Super Sleuths, and welcome to Admit One, your movie ticket. I'm your host, Jim. I know our last two episodes have been comic book movie themed, but I promise you that won't always be the case, and to prove that to you, today we're looking at 2009's Sherlock Holmes, starring Robert Downey Jr. So, I'm not really sure what initially drew me to this movie. I don't know if it was Robert Downey Jr. himself, or the steampunk theme, or Guy Ritchie, or whatever. Robert Downey Jr. it's only 4 years really after his big resurgence, starting with Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, which maybe we'll do one day. I was a fan of Guy Ritchie to begin with. I remember when Snatch came out, my mom and her friends went and saw it, and they walked out, which is insane to me. So I never watched it for the longest time. And I remember when I was a senior in high school, our high school made us do what are called senior projects. So you had to look at a field you were interested in and shadow someone from that field and stuff like that. And I was wanting to direct movies at the time. So through a relationship, which I won't talk about right now, I was able to get in contact with Scott Derrickson, who is actually coming out with Doctor Strange, in about 2 months at the time of this recording. He hadn't done a whole lot at this time. I think maybe he was starting work on The Day the Earth Stood Still, but I believe at this time the only thing he had done was Hellraiser Inferno, which is underrated in my opinion, but maybe we'll talk about that later. So we're sitting at the Elephant Bar in Arcadia or some such place, and he had told me about Snatch, and he was the reason really why I went and watched that movie. And since then, that was maybe 2004, 2003, I loved Guy Ritchie. I went and bought Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, of course Snatch, and then he kind of dropped off a little bit, if you will. His last couple of movies were lackluster. They didn't quite connect with me. This movie really, really turned it around for me. It put him back on course, if you will. And like I said, I guess I didn't say that, but I love the look of steampunk. I don't know what it is. I hope that once superhero movies have run their course, that we get like a steampunk explosion of movies. That would make me extremely happy. I also like that this movie isn't an origin story. There's lots of little tidbits that allude to their history, but you never quite see it at the beginning, which it's great. And it also never takes itself too seriously. There's always a playful tone about things. Even if you get that sense of danger, you always know that he's going to come out on top. And that's not a bad thing in this movie. And you can really see the chemistry between Holmes and Watson. Robert Downey Jr.'s and Jude Law's character. I don't know if they've worked together before, to be honest with you. And I think Robert Downey Jr. has that effect on most movies, it seems like. I think he's probably great to work with, as opposed to some actors out there. So you can really see that relationship come through on the big screen and in whatever movie he's in. They also spend a lot of time doing their actual jobs in this movie, detecting things. That detecting is also balanced nicely with great action scenes, which is where Ritchie really shines. Holmes is like a Victorian Batman, even though I'm sure Bats had some Sherlock influence since he came before. But in these last couple of Batman movies, you really don't see him detecting much, even though he's quote-unquote the world's greatest detective. So I would like to see that in a future Batman movie. Hint, hint out there, guys. Coming from one of the biggest Batman fans. But I digress. What Ritchie also brings to this is his visual style, and one of those things that really shines through in this is those breakdowns of the fights where he'll tell you exactly what he's doing, and it's in slow motion as he takes those punches and those kicks and those defensive moves. He knows what he's doing, and had this gone to another director, I don't know if that would have really come through. And then he comes in and parlays that slow motion trick into the slaughterhouse explosion. So you can really pick apart that scene and see exactly what happens. And it's still pulse pounding. Like, it's still an action scene, even though it's in incredibly slow motion. Another genius move that he had was casting Mark Strong in the role of Blackwood. Mark Strong is one of those actors that you see in everything, but you might not know who he is. He's kind of like Brendan Gleeson. He's in Harry Potter, he's in Bruges, Braveheart. He's been around forever. And he always seems to elevate whatever he's in. Maybe not Green Lantern so much, but most everything else that I've seen him in. And I like the fact that you knew that his magic was shenanigans, but you couldn't quite figure out until Holmes explained it in his sarcastic tone. And it's one of those movies that it's fun to watch on subsequent viewing to try and pick up all the little hints that they leave behind, like Blackwood's tricks and Sherlock's fake nose when he chases Adler, things like that. And you can kind of point it out to people who haven't seen the movie before, like, hey, pay attention to that right there. So it seems that nowadays everyone's looking to make something into a shared universe or a franchise of some sort, which isn't a bad thing, don't get me wrong. But if you come in from the beginning with the idea for a trilogy, but you don't have it mapped out, I think you're shooting yourself in the foot. I really do. You need that overall arc. You can't just have 3 movies, which, again, I can see the positive to that. If you're doing a trilogy and you have 3 contained stories, if one of them doesn't quite work out well, you can move around it. It's not holding you to that mythos. I think Marvel is playing with fire a little bit in that term. If one of their movies doesn't work out, it's kind of hard to ignore that because they have such ramifications. Now, they know what they're doing, don't get me wrong. So the chances of that happening are very slim. But you could have the potential for a misstep or a misfire or something like that. So having future installments in mind is not going to hurt anybody in the least. This movie embraces that. It understands that to an extent, if you will. It doesn't rope itself into a corner by what it does either, by introducing the next villain in this one. Batman Begins kind of did it with the Joker card, but that was all it did, was say, and that was more fan service than anything. But this one, he's in it through the whole thing. His motivations are throughout. But do you see him? No, because they didn't know what they were going to do with him, or who was going to play him. He's kept in the shadows. You never see his face. That's how I would do it. You'll hear me talk about that a lot. Like, that's the sequel I would write, or that's the kind of movie I would write, where the people who, you set up these villains ahead of time, so their motivations are known, and it's not just you're spending a whole movie explaining things. You can actually hash out their motivations behind it, things like that. He's in it from the beginning, and he plays a large part, even though he isn't present. He has his henchman, if you will, in Irene Adler. I just wish they would have followed through with his story from the first one a little bit. I don't know if that was meant to be like a MacGuffin or a red herring or something like that. But it's never mentioned again. We'll talk about it in a little bit. But it's never brought up again, that piece that she takes for him. So that was a little bit disappointing. Another thing that makes this whole movie a well-rounded experience is the music. Personally, I felt that before this, and I need to go back and look at it again, but I felt that Hans Zimmer was getting a little stale, but this kind of course-corrected me. I like his stuff, don't get me wrong. He's got some of the best soundtracks. I own, I think, more from him than anybody else. But his stuff can sometimes run together, and you can hear it too, similar themes, with that heavy drum, but it's still got his little flair. And this one, it's still got that heavy drum rhythm and stuff like that, but this one is distinctly separate from anything else. With those guitar rhythms and things like that, it just sets itself apart big time. And like what I was going back to earlier, it leaves it open for a sequel, but it's also a contained story, even with the Moriarty stuff. And that's also kind of covering your bases. If this movie would have flopped, it wouldn't have bothered me, you know. Golden Compass is an excellent example of a movie that set itself up for a franchise and then flopped, and then you didn't get anything else. That's a tough movie to watch because it just kind of ends, kind of like Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings, we probably would have got all three anyway because they filmed them all at the same time. Would they have looked the same? I don't know. But that's a discussion for a different day. So moving on to Sherlock Holmes 2, or Sherlock Holmes: A Game of Shadows, because again, you have to be covering your bases this day and age, so nothing has a 2 anymore. It's not Sherlock Holmes 2. It's not Captain America 2. Every movie has to have their own little subtitle to set it apart. This one was one of those movies where it was fast-tracked production, so only 2 years later is it coming out, which means as this movie is kind of just making its way out of people's minds, they're already working on the sequel. Sometimes that hurts, sometimes it helps. Well, I guess it doesn't really help, but it doesn't hurt anything, and sometimes you can totally see that it was rushed. This one's kind of in the middle. It picks up, it was made during the explosion of Noomi Rapace, who was the original girl with the dragon tattoo as far as her American roles. She, of course, followed that up with Prometheus and a Colin Farrell movie that I can't quite think of at the moment. This one drops you right in the middle of the action. Almost Medias Res. Am I saying that right? But are we missing a piece of the puzzle? I kind of feel like it expects us to know things. And not just what happened to that piece that Adler stole off of Blackwood's machine, even though that's never brought up, at least to me. If you notice where it's at, let me know. I'd like to watch it and kind of know for myself. But again, was that a MacGuffin or a red herring or whatever that term is? I don't know. Did they just forget? That's entirely possible. Did they think it was stupid and want to forget about it? I don't know. The first one was more action-oriented, which this one comes in a little more cerebral. There's still action there, but this one, the how and the why of the main character is a little less cut and dry. It requires more sleuthing on our part, the audience's part. It's not a who done it, but how is the main character going to catch him? I guess the first one was as well, but this one tackles that a little more in a different way, if you will. It's still a detective story, but it feels like an episode of Law and Order. It doesn't take what the first one made and build upon it. It kind of falls back on generic methods of stuff. The discoveries are a little more coincidental rather than earned. He doesn't do as much sleuthing in this as he does in the first one, which is what set that first one apart. It was a straight-up detective story. This one's a little more handed to him, if you will. And it's not as much fun to point at the mysteries in this one. I don't know if there really are any. The rewatch I did for this one, I did in a hospital room at like midnight, so I apologize. My memory of this isn't as clear, but this one just, we'll talk about it in a minute, but it's not as fun. It's cool that they made him a crime-fighting badass, but you kind of see he's not your typical crime-fighting badass. Like Sherlock is the latchkey to Watson, as opposed to the traditional other way around. But he's so into himself that he doesn't want to admit that, and he will do anything he can to not be the latchkey, even though he knows he is. And he also seems to move on from Adler really quick. You'd think the love of his life, he'd be a little more sad that she's dead. But once she's dead, that's kind of it. We don't hear much about her again. And on that, this one definitely takes the sequel adage to heart that it needs to be bigger and darker. And it's dark. He straight up dies, and he dies twice, kind of. He dies for real the once in the train car, and then he lets everyone thinks he dies when he, spoiler alert, falls off the edge into the water down below with Moriarty. The slow-mo scene in this isn't as inventive, but it's still entertaining as hell as they're running away from those giant guns. But what it does do right, instead of repeating all this shit, like the slow-mo scenes and the detective stuff, they do a fight breakdown, but it doesn't go as he planned, which is a nice little shake-up. I liked those, but after a while, like, they would get a little bit, they can get a little stale, you know? It also delves deeper into the Holmes mythology with Moriarty and stuff like that, and the back and forth between them is great. That's probably one of the highlights of this movie is their relationship, and not just their chemistry together, but the characters' relationship. Holmes truly has met his nemesis, like his arch enemy, his Harvey Dent to his Two-Face, if you will. They're a perfect match for each other, those two characters. Moriarty even taps into his breakdowns, which I thought was another way to kind of shake up that trope that they set up in the first one. And Sherlock is actually nervous around him, as opposed to Blackwood. He knew exactly what he was dealing with Blackwood. In this one, he's unsure. He doesn't know what he's doing because he's a smarter guy. And back to the Batman reference, Moriarty is Holmes's Joker. And I'm not familiar with the books. I would really like to read them. But I'm backlogged with books so bad that I don't know if I ever will. But Moriarty seems overly equipped to me. Not that, here we are with Sherlock Holmes, who's a karate master and a genius detective. It just seemed weird that Moriarty could do the things that he did. And where were his cool wrist guns? I liked those from the first one. That would have been neat to see. More like traps and things like that. Because he's a genius. So that would have been a nice little touch. But it is what it is. And I can't quite put my finger on it. But I believe the story of the bad guy starting a war for profit has been done before. Again, if you know what I'm talking about, let me know. I'd love to look at that and see. It's not that they can't redo something like that, but I would like to know what movie that's from. And I really thought we'd get a part 3. Did we not get one so quickly because of the tepid response? I know this one's not as good as the first one. That happens sometimes. And they've recently started talking about doing a third one again. So I would really hope that we would get a third one. Go back to the roots of the first one. Kind of like what Batman did. Kind of circle around to your first entry. Retread some stuff there and give us a brand new entry. So that does it for Sherlock Holmes. If I missed anything, you want to talk about, reach out to me on Twitter. Be nice, though. I'm only here because I love movies. I don't claim to be a movie genius by any means. So let me know what you'd like to hear me do, and we'll see you next time. Just till next time, that's a wrap.
Mr. Brown, that's a little too close to Mr. Shit. Are you the police?
No, man. We're musicians. I work for Kaiser Soze.
But this way, no, homie!
I work for Kaiser Soze.
But this way, no, homie!
Here's the fucking money, shithead!